In this age of fake news and alternative facts, how do you decide what's true and what's false? How would you decide if I was real or an AI-generated simulation? These questions seem to be taking on more relevance by the day. I am real, promise. But others you encounter on TV or elsewhere may intentionally try to misinform you. They could be the media or politicians or some powerful tech giant trying to manipulate you. Now, how do you begin to protect yourself? Our next guest studies this problem from the side of the believer, the one who decides what's true for themselves. Adam Berinsky is a professor of political science at MIT who researches why we as the public are so vulnerable to misinformation. Why do we accept claims that may appear obviously false? Why does it sometimes seem as if we want to believe it? Up next, all things mis and disinformation with Adam Berinsky. You're watching The InnerView. Good to have Professor Berinsky with us on The InnerView. Thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Great. Good. Thank you for having me.
So, in your book title, you question or explain why we accept misinformation. Why do we accept it, or why is it so easy for us to accept it on a sort of public mass level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say that there's a couple factors there. I think one is that there's a general tendency for people to want to believe narratives that are in line with their general beliefs. So I study American politics. So in our country, a lot of what happens is what Democrats like to believe things that are good for Democrats, Republicans like to believe things that are good for Republicans. So there is this tendency for what we call motivated reasoning. But in addition, there's a difference. Different kinds of people are more or less likely to believe these fanciful stories. So I always think about, thinking about at a holiday, it's just Christmas, Hanukkah here in the US. I had friends and family over, and there's always a relative that you try to avoid, right? They've always got some sort of crazy story. And so think about those on one side, and the other side, people who reject all sorts of stories. And so when these two things come together, motivated reasoning and this willingness to believe stories, that it's not all Republicans who think that Obama was not born in the US, or that Trump was the 2020 election was stolen from him. But those Republicans who are inclined to believe these kinds of crazy stories, who have high on this belief in misinformation, are more inclined to accept those stories.
Yeah, it's interesting that now that you bring up the two binaries and the polarization, I didn't plan to ask you about this, but something that came to mind was the Hunter Biden laptop story, right? Because it's almost like there was such a deluge of misinformation and noise and all of that came from the Republicans and Trump and stuff, that I wonder if then liberals and Democrats didn't want to look at something that was actually legitimate at an institutional level as well, like New York Times and stuff. They were downplaying it because they expected and accepted all the other side stories to be nonsense, and then they didn't want to even engage with it when it actually had a lot of truth in it.
Right. So I think, you raise a good point here, which is this question of what is the truth? So how do we determine what is true and what is false? And, so I'm an academic, so, I like to take a very deep dive into these questions. And so I like to say not so much things are true or false, but things are supported or unsupported by the balance of publicly available evidence. So you can think about things like Watergate was a rumor until it wasn't. You could same thing with the Hunter Biden laptop, that there's a time of uncertainty, and at the time of uncertainty, people are inclined to believe the things that are consistent with their beliefs. So this is true not just of the acceptance of false stories, but the rejection of true stories. You can think about same thing with how climate change, evidence about climate change in this country, how Republicans react to that is a kind of a rejection of that, not on the basis of the evidence per se, but on what they wish that the evidence was.
Yeah.
And, a lot of the times we're dealing with ambiguous information. As you said, the Hunter Biden laptop story, questions about the origins of COVID, and that there is a desire to jump toward a truth. But as facts emerge, things evolve, and same thing with medicine. That one day we read that having a glass of wine is good for your heart health. The next day we read that even a small glass of wine can cause cancer. The facts change, evidence change, and people need to adjust to them.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be a tale as old as time itself, where our guys, we're willing to easily believe the good things about our guys and easily believe the bad things about the other side, and very easily reject the bad things supposedly of our side. And so I guess you take those sort of hardwired tribal aspects of human nature and you catapult it into this information age. It's amplified, right? I want a little bit of point of clarity from you. What's the difference technically between misinformation and disinformation?
Sure. So that misinformation is something that is false or unsupported by the facts. The distinction between misinformation and disinformation gets at the intent of the sender. So as you said, now I'm very interested on the reception side. So I think about how ordinary people interact with the political world. And so misinformation, disinformation, though, gets at the question of the meaning of the sender, right? So if I tell you something that is false, that I know is false, in an attempt to deceive you, that's disinformation. The problem, though, is if you then say that if you believe what I told you and you tell it to someone else, then it becomes misinformation. So it's a distinction that people make, but it's very much about thinking about campaigns. And thinking about what sort of, as you said at the beginning, what media, what politicians, what different groups are trying to do with it. But on the reception side, thinking about ordinary people, if I believe you, then your disinformation has worked at me, but then I become an agent that I can spread that as misinformation.
Got it. How big or bad is the potential for misinformation and disinformation, given this marriage of the tech bros and politics now, the broligarchy, as some people call it? So you have billionaires at the levers of these massive tools that everybody's engaged in, and you've got them also vying for political power and wedded to some of the most powerful people in the world. Tell me about the potential for nastiness down the line.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that there always has been. It's interesting what you said before, that I think you called this a tale as old as time. It's sort of people believing what they want to believe. Sort of the study of rumors, conspiracy theories, misinformation, goes back to ancient times. But, in the US, can think about during the Revolutionary War, different actors were trying to get different stories across. So there's nothing new about that. There's nothing new about actors trying to get their stories into the sort of believed by the mass public. But it's different about the internet is the scale. And so a lot of what I talk about in my book is it's not just that I seek out information, but if I'm online, I'm incidentally exposed to information. So it might be that I'm looking at my Facebook feed and I see posts that my friends made. I'm not seeking this out, but if they're posting about political news, then that is something that can be incidentally transmitted. So think about this as what I call incidental exposure. Saying you just kind of run into it online. And the online platforms have really, so what's changed about that is that it's much easier now and much more likely to be exposed to misinformation, not because people are seeking it out, but because there's a bigger platform for that. And to the extent that tech companies are, sort of the actors are vying for political power, or, sort of wanting to not be regulated, which I think is true of a lot of these tech companies, sort of they want to sort of be let alone to do what they want to do, not necessarily for nefarious reasons, but as you said, there really is the potential, if there is a bad actor out there, that the tools are there through this incidental exposure, through this wide platform, to really get out misinformation. And so back to the disinformation, misinformation distinction, what starts as disinformation by someone who's trying to spread it can quickly become misinformation that a lot of people can be exposed to. Again, not because they're seeking it, but because they just happen to come across it in their everyday life.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you want regulation?
Well, I mean, it's very tricky, sort of, again, sort of being a social scientist, I can sort of say, here's the different problems to think about. The question is, like, who gets to write the regulations there? In the European Union, there's been a lot of regulations around privacy. I think the problem with a lot of these regulations is it's not that they're poorly intended. There's good intentions behind them, but sort of as a matter of course, it doesn't necessarily get at the problem. So I was I was at a conference in France a few months ago, and I opened my internet browser, and I was trying to do a little shopping, and sort of the warnings about the pop-ups and the cookies, sort of that just took away from the experience there. And advertisers aren't using cookies these days, so you kind of chase the old technology.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very similar sort of thing, is that even if regulations are well intended, they might not do what the people who write them intend them to do. And you do sort of get this question of who watches the watchmen, right? In the sense that if we don't, maybe tech companies shouldn't police themselves, but if the government can write the regulation, who's watching the government to write these regulations?
With all the noise and the dishonesty and fake news out there, is the majority coming from those with malevolent intent, or is the majority happening kind of organically, where a little rumor gains legs and, as you say, misinformation spreads, where people just sort of forward on WhatsApp or whatever, and others, guards are down and they accept it when they should be more critical? Like, is it being done by more evil people, or is it done by innocent slips in a bad system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a little of both, right? So thinking about where did these stories arise from, it's sort of thinking that people want to, sort of spread stories that aid their cause. So there's, I'm a political scientist, I'm not a business school professor, but there's a large literature in marketing that talks about essentially how can companies respond to rumors about their products. So, I remember when I was growing up, there were urban legends that McDonald's had worms in their hamburgers. Right, and that this was something that was combated. Now I tell my students this today, and they say, "Oh no, that's not true. That's about Wendy's, right?" And so stories come again and again. So as me as a middle schooler telling these stories, right, I was not a bad actor trying to undermine McDonald's, but I was a tool of the people who were trying to undermine that business. So again, it's sort of like the rumors are created and are started at the top by people who have interest in trying to either get you to believe something or get you to disbelieve everything.
Does the medium play a role? So are we more prone to accepting misinformation if we're scrolling through our feed versus formally sitting down and opening, I don't know, the Sunday newspapers and switching on to reading the news?
I mean, so I've done some work with David Rand and Gord Pennycook, who are some psychologists, and this is, I should say that this is their work that I've kind of joined their team. But the idea is that we want them to focus on accuracy, right? And the idea is that when you're scrolling through social media, you don't have that filter up where you're thinking about like, oh, is this true? This is not. You're just trying to be entertained. You're not paying very close attention. And what we found is that some intervention, like thinking about the title of my book is Why We Believe Misinformation and How to Fight It. On this how to fight it part is not telling people what is true or false, but reminding them that they want to share accurate information. Because you ask people in an opinion poll, not just in the US, but across the world, how important is it for you to share accurate information online? A vast majority of people say it's very important to them. And so if you could just remind them of this, so basically take a moment to think, is this true, this is false, before you share something, then that's something that could have a big effect.
So The Guardian nowadays, it has a little annotation that says this article is, I don't know, 15 years old, 20 years old. And then WhatsApp will say forwarded many times. So we're seeing platforms, outlets trying to install some safeguards. Does any of it work?
Yeah, but I mean, so these are contextual cues, right? So again, thinking about sort of thinking about, whenever I talk to audiences, so I talk to groups of students, I talk to different companies. I always tell people to the audience, I say, you're unusual in that you care about politics. You're listening to me, a political scientist, talk about politics. Most of the people, most of the time, don't care about politics. They don't pay attention. And so if we can give them these contextual cues, this is like, well, hold on a minute, think, is this accurate? Is this supported by the evidence? Before they share that information, that can be effective there.
So let's set aside media outlets for a second, because a lot of the time you sort of know, okay, this outlet is left-leaning, right-leaning, this one's paid for by this state, that state, and whatever, so you know which way they lean or bend. But when it comes to information on the internet, how much of blame should we apportion to the algorithm? So the fact that it just funnels all this information into your echo chamber, you're not seeing the other side at all some of the times. So, and these are on big issues, climate change, Israel-Palestine, whatever it might be, an election, people are just not engaging at all with a real version of the other side. And to what extent is it the fault of the actual algorithm?
I think that's an interesting question. I think, if we actually look at how people interact, there are people who are in these filter bubbles, right? Sort of people who choose to only see information about one side of a political issue, will only look at sources about that one side of the issue. But again, so that this is a small portion of the population. So if we think about what is the danger of filter bubbles, for the people in those filter bubbles, it is very dangerous. But it is a small portion of this. This is true, again, not just in the US, but in other countries as well. So I would say, in some cases, the danger is overstated, right? In sort of what people are being fed. The bigger danger is on what people choose to see for themselves, right? So again, thinking about an algorithm can feed you the content from one side or the other politically. But the bigger problem is that people who are very sort of entrenched in their beliefs don't want to see anything else. So again, it's not so much about the internet per se, but about the individuals interacting with the internet. So again, sort of thinking about like what is old is new again. It used to be that in the age there were newspapers that were tied to specific political parties, and that's still true. So the partisan press is nothing new. That this is something that existed in the U.S. in the late 19th century, early 20th century. The problem is that the internet is given that people who want to find that kind of news, that kind of slanted news, that there's a bigger palette that they can choose from in order to get that news. I would say it's not so much, sort of, I said, like, we don't want to, sort of, we don't want to, not saying don't blame tech companies, but if we're looking for people to blame, thinking about these hyper partisans, right? These people who are really entrenched in their interest, and what the internet has given them is the ability to find information and also to find other people who are like them. That this is something, thinking about different groups and kind of thinking about how people choose to interact online. That it used to be, sort of, I'm of an age where I remember, that there was things about rumors about the John F. Kennedy assassination. These were translated by people who would have conferences and they would send, photographed, Xerox copies of newsletters to each other. That was an inefficient way to spread information. You can get all that information online at the touch of a fingertip there. So it's not just that you can find information that fits with your belief. You can find other people who share your beliefs and kind of creating that community there. So again, I don't want to say that algorithms are not important or that tech companies don't bear some responsibility for the problem. But again, I think a lot of this is about the choices that people make in an era in which it's much easier to
Mm.
find like-minded sources and like-minded people.
Is it a good age to live in when you're if you're a dishonest, narcissistic politician who
Uh,
likes to repeat lies?
yes, well, I think again, this is, but sort of like what's old is new again, right? That
Mm.
this is again nothing new, right? In terms of kind of the modern era, these kinds of politicians. It's just that the platform is much bigger, right? And the ability to reach people is much larger there.
Mm.
So sort of, don't have any, sort of particular people in mind. I think there is this general class of populists, populist politicians throughout the world. They're taking advantage of this technology in a way to spread their message and to spread misinformation.
Mm.
Um, but again, sort of that there's nothing, it's not that there's nothing new under the sun, but we've seen this before. Just
Mm.
that we're seeing on sort of, I said that it's kind of like it's misinformation on steroids because
Right.
we have the ability to spread that information in ways that we didn't 30 years ago, and at a scale that we couldn't 30 years ago, to groups of people who would not have been aware of these issues at all 30 years ago.
Yeah. There's a clip of you on Samantha Bee's show where you say the best way to, I don't know, quell a rumor, or no, you said one of the best ways to give a rumor more legs is to try to debunk it because repeating it makes it worse, or something like that. And of course, they do their funny Daily Show sort of reaction from the reporter going, whatever. So tell me more about that, because this idea of like, even when you're trying to debunk it, the fact that you're mentioning it perpetuates it, makes it worse. So then what do you do?
Yeah. So actually, this is a great point, because actually the science on that conclusion. So that clip was from 2017. The social science on this has moved forward, right? So back in 2017, we would say don't repeat a lie even to debunk it, because that makes it stronger. What we found is actually that that's not the case. That it's okay to repeat the lie in the act of debunking. Now, I said like you don't want to repeat it too much, that you don't want it to become too familiar.
Mm.
But what we found is that so Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler wrote one of the earliest pieces, so saying this, that basically that there can be a backfire effect. But they co-authored a piece recently. They said like, well, we've looked at the evidence. It turns out we were wrong as a general rule. So right, it's not quite as bad as they say. So that's good news, right? It's to say that we can repeat that. Now, sort of in terms of the kinds of strategies that I think that we should do is, I think what's very important, what I focused on is thinking not just about the message, but the messenger, right?
Mm.
So thinking about who delivers this fact check or who delivers this correction. And so, it's I'm a big fan of fact checkers as professionals.
Mm.
So thinking that these are the people who are trained to determine whether or not particular claims are supported by the evidence,
Mm.
but they're not the best people to deliver that message, right? So, if I say something to you that you don't like, you can either change what you think about that thing, is
Mm.
that fact correct, or you can change what you think about me. And we've seen this in the U.S. that fact checkers have become it's a bad word
Mm.
in any sense, in that people don't trust fact checkers because they're saying things that they don't like.
Right. And
So
fact checking itself can be a form of propaganda as well.
yeah,
It can.
exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so right, the thing about that, you want to have properly trained people
Right.
who are deciding whether or not something's supported by the evidence. Those aren't the best people to deliver that message, right? So
Right.
in my book, I talk about stuff with death panels. So these rumors that the Affordable Care Act that was proposed by Obama, passed by Congress, was going to create death panels. So you have government-run panels that decide whether or not people should get um, life-saving healthcare. So, sort of
Mm.
whether grandma lives or dies. Now,
Mm.
these were not true, right? This was a distortion of a provision that had end-of-life counseling, which is saying like basically at the end of your life, like what sort of palliative care do you want? Sort of thinking about that sort of thing. But it became these death panels.
Yeah.
Now, you had independent sources, so people from the American Medical Association saying, "Oh, this isn't true." Now, those checks were somewhat effective, but what's more effective is having Republican politicians saying, like, you might have heard people say this, but this is true. So people speaking against their apparent interest
Right.
is the best way. So thinking not just about the message, but the messenger, right? And the example I use is, thinking about so McDonald's, so when they weren't putting worms on their hamburgers, back in the 1990s, they sold a product called supersized fries that was essentially two large fries put together. And at some point they stopped selling this. Now, they didn't say you shouldn't eat so many French fries, but if McDonald's, which is a company that makes its money selling French fries, right, gets rid of a product, and that's a really good signal that maybe
Right.
you shouldn't be eating so many French fries.
Yeah, good point. It reminds me of when John McCain sort of intervened when that woman said, "I don't like Obama, he's a Muslim." And then McCain said, "No, ma'am, he's not a Muslim." So on the one hand, he sort of fact-checked it because it was his apparent sort of competitor or enemy. But then, and then he became ambiguous because his next line was, "He's a very good man." So he's not a Muslim, he's a very good man. Anyway, that's another story altogether.
Yeah.
But Adam Berinsky, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We're out
Thank
of
you so
time.
much. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks, take care.
Take care.